Hello, welcome back again. And a few months back, we started a new series of conversation, what we call CGSP interviews, where we do receive different expert and from the global south and the global north, where we talk about different issues related to China engagement in the global south. Last time I received Tim Zion, and with whom we spoke about China private-public partnership in Africa, especially in the framework of the Tazara Railway. If you've missed that episode, you can find it in our playlist on our YouTube channel, where you can find a much more detail about what the subject we've talked about last time. Today, I'm receiving someone we used to have on the China Global South on the podcast. But today we're gonna receive him in this video interview, where we are going to talk about China influence in the African space, in the African media space. We talk about that a lot. We hear about that a lot. But how much is it that we really know about China influence in that space, what China does, what China don't, what the strategy, what its approach on that space? And for that, I'm going to be receiving Paul Nantulya. Paul Nantulya is a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at Washington. He research and prepare analysis on contemporary issues related to Africa-China issue. His area of expertise includes China foreign policy, China-Africa relation, Africa partnership with Southeast Asian countries, mediation and peace process, the Great Lake regions, and East and Southern Africa. Paul Nantulya is an expert on all issues related to China-Africa military relation. If you want to know more about China-Africa military relation, what's China military strategy in Africa, I'm going to advise you, go and search for Paul Nantulya on Google. You won't be disappointed. You're going to find a lot of content, a lot of analysis, in-depth analysis about China engagement with Africa military and what's happened. I'm going to cut it short. I'm going to cut this introduction short. Let's go and have that conversation with Paul Nantulya, with whom we're going to talk about his latest article about China media influence in Africa. Let's go and have that conversation with Paul. So, as I was saying in my introduction, it's my pleasure today to receive another China-Africa expert who's been writing extensively about what China does in Africa. Last week, I was reading his paper, the new paper he published. I was quite surprised because I've known him writing papers about China military engagement in Africa, China-Africa strategy and everything. And by the way, if you want to know about everything about China-based strategy in Africa, what China do, the PLA and everything, is very well versed into it. I'm going to recommend you to read all his paper and publication. Paul Nantulya is an expert on those issues. And that's when I read his paper last week talking about Chinese media strategy. I was like, wow, Paul writing about media. I was like, this gotta have a security angle to it. And I was like, let me reach out to him and let's have him in a conversation. That's why we are having Paul today for this conversation again, where we're going to be talking about China media strategy in Africa. Paul, good morning to you in Washington, D.C. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great, Geraud, and it's great to be here on the platform. I think I've appeared on this platform now maybe 3 or 4 times.
Exactly.
Talking about different things. So I'm very happy again to be talking about China's media offensives.
Oh yes.
Yes.
You talk about offensive, you really you are putting the framework of like, we are talking strategy, we are talking military, tech security. Let's jump right to it. So there is a large debate when we talk about China influence in Africa. We have talked about economy, politics, geopolitics and everything. But we also recently starting to talk about media, because we've seen a lot of Chinese engagement in the media space in Africa. We see CGT in Africa. We see China media in West Africa, in Francophone. We see local local content of Chinese media in Africa. We see a lot of African indifferent Chinese media in Africa and as well. So when we see all of that, we kind of worry, like we kind of wonder, okay, China is now moving in that space in Africa. China is trying to really to become that's I wouldn't say main, but to become that actor of media space in Africa. And you wrote an interesting paper about talking about Chinese media and influence in Africa. And I wanted to have your take on what's the truth, the lies, the in-betweens of information about the Chinese media influence in Africa. What should we know and pay attention about that? Tell us about your paper, Paul.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm really humbled that you would select this paper for discussion today. Of course, at the beginning of this conversation, I will also like to recognize other top thinkers on these issues that have really inspired many of these ideas that you'll see in this paper. People like Bob Wekesa, who's at the Witwatersrand University, is one of them. And there are very many others. So I'm really drawing on the work that many other great thinkers in the China-Africa space have done. So first and foremost, I think, at the beginning of our talk, I talked about, I mentioned media offensives. And the reason I did that is because, this combative perspective of media influence is basically a staple of official Chinese thinking. A lot of attention is put into it. The media domain is seen as a battlefield. It is seen as a space where China, that is officially, is combating all kinds of what the Chinese Communist Party would call attempts to smear China, attempts to undermine the Chinese Communist Party, and so on, and attempts to discredit it, right? And so we've seen, and this is not new, this goes all the way back to the 1950s, that Chinese media agencies tend to have this framing of combat, this framing of battle, this framing of battle of ideas in the media space. So definitely, China is doing a lot, is investing a lot in contesting the media space in Africa, and we see this in 3 historical phases. The first phase was, the era of the anti-colonial movements in Africa. Media engagement and media offensives were a huge part of that. There's a tendency to look at the military training that the People's Liberation Army was offering different guerrilla movements like ZANU-PF of Zimbabwe, the SWAPO Party of Namibia, the African National Congress of South Africa at some point, and all these other different movements, Frelimo of Mozambique, and all these others. There's a tendency to kind of look at that and to quantify and evaluate Chinese contributions in terms of that. But Chinese engagements were much larger, and the media occupied almost every segment of engagement, right? And so I think it was in Cairo where China, where the People's Republic of China established its first media enterprise on the African continent. And what that media enterprise did, at that particular point in time, was to develop narratives for the liberation movements, give them a voice, validate their ideas. Of course, within that, giving them a voice, there was also the infusion of a Chinese
ideas behind
doctrine, Chinese military doctrine. The Peasant War, the People's War, the Protracted People's War. This is something that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, was trying to sort of infuse into the African continent. So these media entities were very, very active. They did not just happen recently. There's that historical phasing that that is important to look at. So this was the first phase. The second phase, we then begin to see after the reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping, China turned inward and began to look into building its economy, reintegrating itself into the international system, attracting Western foreign direct investment, reaching some sort of rapprochement with the United States, and so on. So there was a change in the texture of Chinese media operations in Africa, where a lot of these ideas were actually being talked about. It was very, very different from the combat-oriented media that was there before. It was a bit of a shift. It was a bit of a change on the African continent, because it's essentially, as China was trying to reform internally, it was trying to promote its ideas of reform for many of these African countries that were emerging from conflict. Perhaps the Chinese model might be
appealing to them.
Appealing, and so on and so forth. So just a little bit of adjustment. Then we have the current phase, which I like to call the phase of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, when China-Africa relations has moved to its highest level. And in this particular phase, we have seen a proliferation of Chinese media entities on the African continent. Whether we talk about Xinhua, we talk about Star Times, which is now basically on line. It's now in line to finish connecting those 10,000. This was a pledge by Xi Jinping at the 2015 FOCAC.
The 10,000 satellite TV on rural communities in Africa.
Yes, in over 22 African. They now have 495 or somewhere there, 495 connections left. So that means that the upcoming FOCAC summit this year, this is going to be one of the
achievements. We've been able to achieve that in the last 8 years. We've been able to connect 10,000 communities in Africa to satellite TV.
Exactly. So we have that. And then we have CGTN, right? And then we have People's Daily. Then we have China Daily. We have all these proliferation of media agencies. But what is very interesting to me, and what appears in this report, is that there tends to be there's a consolidation. There's the whole idea of consolidating China's voice. Right. So when we look at what the model that Xinhua is using, which was developed in Kenya, you have all these media organizations that are, they're all in one building. Sometimes they actually, even in terms of the stories that they tell, and the kind of narratives that they're putting out on the African continent, there's some competition between these different agents. They have a different accent, they have a different slant, right? But nevertheless, they all occupy that. The Chinese Communist Party calls this voice of China. Okay, they've pumped, I believe the figure is $6 billion into this enterprise. The whole idea that everything that Chinese media entities do, and this is not just limited to the African continent, operates under, I call it under one roof strategy.
Okay.
Right? Of trying to reach different audiences, trying to appeal to different audiences. So CGTN, for instance, is really trying to appeal to the elite and to the professionals.
Yeah.
Right? So when you look at they have this show called, Faces of Africa.
Yeah.
Which is kind of China's answer, official China's answer to the Voice of America.
Voice of America.
What was it called? We loved this show, as students. Straight Talk Africa.
Oh yes,
Straight Talk Africa. So this was CGTN's answer to Straight Talk Africa, right? The idea of having a show where you have Africans that are doing very well in business, in politics, and then you have historical Africans who are sort of like the founding fathers of Africa. So Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, and all these very popular figures that are lionized. Senghor of Leopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal, right? Samora Machel of Mozambique, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo of South Africa. These are, Toivo Jatoivo of Namibia. These are names, Adelaide Tambo, Albertina Sisulu, Frini Ginwala. These are men and women that are lionized all over the African continent. So they do this show. And obviously, you don't see Chinese faces in these shows. These are African faces, right? Which brings me to the second point. After talking about the spread of this media and looking at how they're operating, it's very different because in the 1950s, and I've looked at some of these broadcasts, the Peking Review, okay, the Red China. There was one called Red China, during the Mao years, right? These were Chinese faces. Many of them were journalists and propagandists from the People's Liberation Army and from the different offices of the Chinese Communist Party, including the office of the chairman, which was Mao Zedong himself, right? Going out to the African continent and actually delivering this content, right? But now it's African faces. So, you talk about people like Beatrice Marshall. Beatrice Marshall is a celebrated veteran Kenyan. I mean, she is just literally one of the most highly respected
Kenyan journalists.
Yes. And she is basically the face of Africa of CGTN, which is, Beatrice Marshall reminds me of Jeff Koinange, who was the African face of CNN. When CNN came up with this CNN Africa. Very popular. And Jeff Koinange became the face of CNN in Africa. In similar light, I look at Beatrice Marshall as the Jeff Koinange of CGTN.
So we've seen that strategy. Communication, it's always been part of Chinese engagement in Africa. That's quite interesting. And
it has always, it has always been part of the engagement. And now it's African faces. I talk about these stories in Kenya, 1,800 stories that are being put out from Chinese media outlets. There's not a single Chinese journalist or a single Chinese face behind these stories. These are stories that are being put out by African journalists that are paid by these different entities. So that's what I talk about, the African face of these narratives. Then of course is the policy framework. And as you said, Geraud, just a few seconds ago, there is a policy architecture behind all this, which emanates from the Communist Party. It has got its structure. It's got its, the working group, the central leading group on propaganda and culture and so on, which basically oversees, because, for a normal African audience, propaganda is kind of a dirty term. It's a dirty word. It's how can you talk about propaganda? You're indoctrinating people. But in the Chinese context, propaganda is actually an instrument of statecraft. There is a working group that deals with it. There's a policy architecture that deals with it, and all the what they call the publicity department. The publicity department of the CCP that is meant for outside consumption. Inside China, if you look at the Chinese text, it is the propaganda department of propaganda. That's what it is, because propaganda is not a dirty term in official China. I always like to distinguish between China and official China because the two are not the same thing. So yes, there's a very elaborate policy architecture. If you look at the resolutions of the 20th National Congress. Right? These are congresses. They're held every 5 years, where there's a change of leadership and, policy architecture, policy direction, and so on. There is always a segment that looks at culture, ideology, ideas, media, sort of communication, sort of voice of China. There's always a segment. And this doesn't just stay at the level of policy resolutions. They're actually translated into policy, and there's supervision of it as well. So it's very, very different from what you'd find in Western countries, where the media is not really, it's private. Yes, you do have state-owned.
That's true.
Like voice of, but, there's a sense that, that level of tightness and control in terms of this is the message and this is what the message must be is very, very different in a Chinese context. And that's, I think, what this report that you so kindly invited me to discuss today is talking about.
It's really interesting because you gave us a very strong background, historical background about what China did in terms of communication, engagement communication in Africa. And in the report, you even mentioned that the impact of that strategy, and you even mentioned the numbers that many Africans are still not appealed by Chinese model. They still want the Western democracy model, and which lead me to the question of like, after so many years of Chinese engagement strategy in Africa, how come we've never get to the point where the Chinese messaging has been adopted and integrated by many African society? Because most of Africans today, they know much more about VOA, CNN, BBC, and, RFI, France Afrique, all of that, but less than from what China did in terms of messaging and communication. It's only recently when we started to see CGT in Africa with African faces that we started to pay attention about what China did in terms of messaging and communication, which at the end kind of raised the question, did Chinese strategy in terms of communication in Africa, did it work at the end? Does it have an impact on African audience?
Yeah, so that, my brother, Geraud, that's an excellent question. And I think to answer it, I'll start by using an anecdote because, anecdotes can be very powerful. So I was in Tanzania last year. Private visit there. And I noticed, one of the things I noticed, I was there for a bit of time, and I noticed the penetration of Chinese media in that country, both digital and mainstream and so on. I saw the Star Times, I took pictures, I saw the Star Times, I saw them, connecting them in all these different places. I looked at the digital, the digital platforms, because exactly. When you go to Tanzania, the broadband, a lot of Africans basically today are getting their news from cell phones.
Exactly.
The African continent, I believe, has one of the highest cell phone penetration rates in the world.
Yeah.
It's something that we tend not to pay attention to. I mean, in countries like Kenya, it's reaching almost 80%.
Exactly.
Right? And it's very high in Tanzania. And now, what was interesting for me in Tanzania is that the broadband infrastructure, it's Huawei, it's ZTE, and others. Okay, among national carriers who compete against each other for market share, but are all running on different Chinese platforms.
Okay.
This was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was this Star Times. So the Star Times, it was very interesting. I was having a conversation with one ordinary Tanzanian, and I said, "Hey, the Star Times." I was trying to get some understanding, and he was like, "Yeah, no, these guys, you don't have you don't pay a subscription, so there's no subscription, because with the DSTV of South Africa, which is the biggest, and now followed by Star Times, you have subscription, and then you have a monthly subscription. You have to pay a monthly connection fee in addition to the services that you want.
Exactly.
Now with Star Times, the model is very different. There's no monthly connection fee. There's no subscription, right? The installation of the satellite dish is free. But so what it does is, if you happen to have money in your pocket, maybe for 1 week, you're lucky, you've been able to get some money, and for 1 week, then you connect and you'll watch for 1 week. If you can, for a month, and then the moment you stop, you stop. The moment you want to start, you start. It could be 2 days, it could be 2 months, it could be a year, right? They found this this Tanzanian was telling me this is what they find very attractive. And really, when you convert it to US dollars, my goodness, it's literally, it's in cents. It's in the lower level figure, $2, $5, $6 and whatnot. But what they get sports, religious channels. You know how popular this is in Africa and so on. They can get the CNN. They also get. Funny enough, all these also run on these platforms. And I asked this Tanzania. I said, "Are you aware that this is a Chinese
product service?"
And it was like, "Oh,
I didn't know.
I didn't know, but so what?
Yeah.
So what? It's getting me what, so this is just an anecdote to show, the kind of penetration, the kind of market research that these media have done. But coming to your question about how effective is it? Because it's one thing to look at the penetration and the market strategy to enter into these media ecosystems in Africa, because really the African media ecosystem, as you well know, is open.
Yeah.
Right. So you have all these content sharing agreements. You have all kinds of things. Some of it is provided free. Others, the Chinese embassy will pay for space, and that pay is not insignificant, because a lot of these media agencies rely on that pay
to survive. Yeah.
Rely on those to survive. Right. But so these are just the tactics. But in terms of what is the effectiveness, now the question then becomes a little bit more nuanced, in the sense that when African stakeholders are asked, what kind of political system do you think is the most effective and advantageous? 70% go for democracy, accountability. This is not necessarily democracy and accountability in terms of American style or Australian style or Indian style. It is really in terms of African, because Africa also has standards.
Yeah.
That are spelled out in the African Union, and things of that nature. 70% of Africans are demanding democracy. 80% of Africans, 80 or 81% of Africans reject one-party rule.
Yeah.
But I think it's 82 or 83% reject military rule. What is interesting also is that these are Afrobarometer
data,
data, and I think Afrobarometer has been on this show as
exactly.
Well. So Afrobarometer, so they, in this latest survey they did, they also asked, and they've been doing this since 1999. I mean, these are credible, right? They asked the question: what about effective but undemocratic government, but which is able to deliver services? Interestingly, Africans reject that.
Yeah.
So they reject even the idea of a government that is effective, but which is undemocratic, completely rejected. So if we imply, it's just by implication, right? Because of course China is a one-party state and so on. I think Chinese colleagues would say, well, but the other parties exist, but really it's the Chinese Communist Party that is dominant, right? This type of system, right? If we look at what Africans are saying, Africans are not buying that. Africans are not buying these features of the Chinese political system. I guess we could even say even of other countries. We could say even of Saudi Arabia, even of the UAE. Africans are not buying this. Africans are buying the idea of democracy. So if the intention of if I'm sitting in Beijing and I'm the director of the publicity department, of the propaganda department, right? This is the department that oversees Chinese media. If I'm the person responsible for that, and if my brief is to say over 10 or 15 years to persuade African stakeholders to prefer or Chinese to promote and instill the Chinese model, I would be very worried that I would lose my job.
Exactly.
When I look at the Afrobarometer reports, this is not happening.
Exactly.
Right? It's actually not happening. So I find that to be very interesting, given the level of investment that is being made, given the number of journalists. Right now, China is training more journalists than any other industrialized country. Through the Belt and Road Network, through this, they call it the China, it's a fellowship run by the China Africa Media Center. It's an outfit of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they get journalists to go. I've talked to quite a few of them. on 18-month fully paid, and they put them in Chinese newsrooms, and they take them to the villages, to the countryside. They take them to Shanghai. They show them the Chinese. These are guided tours, right? And in so many other ways, right? The content sharing agreements and so on. Those investments, if the purpose of those investments is to change African stakeholders' minds to buy elements of the Chinese model, then I would say that it is really not working.
Yeah.
And I think this is an important message because, sometimes we tend to overplay, the effectiveness,
yes.
Yeah, the finesse, the finesse that goes into it, the strategic thinking that goes into it, the preparation that goes, we tend to get, how do I call it? We tend to get this, what's the word? I'm looking of the word. I'm looking. We not disoriented. It's a word I'm looking for. We tend to get numbed. By the numbers, right? In terms of if this is how many,
overwhelmed by the numbers and
overwhelming. But when we look at Afrobarometer and others, then it's just not. And it shows that African audiences.
Yeah.
The thing that also makes me happy, Geraud, is that African audiences are savvy. These are not audiences that are just sitting there waiting to be told what to do. And, somebody comes and says, do this, and Africans do it, even if it's against their interest. No, because those same Afrobarometer reports are telling us that Chinese popularity in Africa has always been above 50%.
Exactly.
At one point, it was almost a 70%.
Economic investment, economic infrastructure, and everything. Yeah.
Yes. So if Chinese influence is welcomed at those very high numbers, but it has no effect whatsoever on the African demand for democracy, then it means that there's something that Africans are buying from China. It means there's something else.
What do you believe? What do you believe when people say that the goal is not really to get people in Africa to love China by when they invest that much in that media, but the goal is to create an environment where any messaging against China will not be welcome anymore? In the sense of saying, instead of communicating that, we want you to love China, we want you to adopt Chinese method and Chinese model, it's not the goal, but we want you to know as much as you can about China, about what we do, about who we are, so that when people are coming from the West or different part of the world saying that Chinese is bad, you say, they are not perfect, but they are not bad. You see what I mean? In the sense of saying that we are not there to try to convince you to love us, but we are there just to convince you enough not to adopt any narrative that's coming against us.
That's an excellent question. And I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of both. Let me use another anecdote. So I was talking to a colleague who works in Dakar at the Cheikh Anta Diop University, and she, along with others, was invited for an extended program in China. That was run by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences, and it was fully blown red carpet, well treated, taken to different parts of China and so on to instill in them, that appreciation of China and so on. And what she told me is that, and which I've heard from other African professionals that have been trained in China, is that it's not really a direct, right? So, in those lecture rooms, they're not being told, you must love us. You must. It's very indirect and it's very subtle, right? Taking them on these guided tours so as to instill them positive impressions of the country, such that when they go back, they might be in a position to say, hey, hang on.
There are nuances to that narrative about China. Yeah.
Yeah, there are nuances, right?
Yeah.
And I somehow get a sense that maybe in to some extent, that might actually be one of the goals of Chinese media strategy in Africa, which is essentially a communication strategy in Africa. It is to basically say that some nuance can be established, which can question, poke holes, or even overturn what China calls offensives against it.
Mm-hmm.
that are being in its own language being waged against the People's Republic of China. So in other words, it's a counter. It's kind of like a counter,
exactly.
And that's also where the combat comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like a counter strategy. And I like to talk about the PLA because the PLA puts media engagement.
Hold on, let's just give me context to people. PLA, for those who are following us, People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, yes.
Yes. So as part of its official doctrine, if you look at the official doctrine that comes out of the political work department in the Central Military Commission, which is responsible for that, right? And the PLA does have its own media mouthpieces, right? The media domain is at par with the physical domains of battle.
Exactly.
Land, air, sea.
Mm-hmm.
This has always been, the concept of the three warfares, right? So the Chinese civilian entities, right, also adopt that. And it's important because it's the Chinese Communist Party that runs the PLA.
Mm-hmm.
So it should not be surprising that Chinese Communist Party thinking within the PLA also spills over into the civilian dimension of it.
Yeah.
So in other words, we need to combat and we need to have a counter strategy and counter offensives that not only tell China's story well, which is, I'm quoting from Xi Jinping, not only tell China's story well, but also combat, discredit, and overturn Western
narrative against
Western,
China.
because the focus has always been on the West.
Yeah.
And what this colleague, she said something very interesting about, so they would take them to they would take them to Shanghai and they would say, do you see that high-speed train? It's not there in America.
Yeah.
Do you see this, do you see how this AI looks at the news and basically gives journalists what they're supposed to do, basically helps them sift through data? That system is not in America. So it's all about showing them things that they believe are not in America.
Yeah.
But which it's all indirect.
What you say about being indirect, it's really true, even for people like us who've studied and lived in China for so many years. When you come from Africa and when you see how China has been transformed during the years of early 2000 until 2013, 14, 15, 16, when still I was there, you really leave China with that feeling of like, I can see a country going from poverty to wealth. I can see a place that was empty field yesterday. Today I see a big building, high-speed train and everything. And when you go back home and when you start listening to narrative, you're like, because I've lived there, because I've seen there, because I've touched it myself, I can tell you there are certain nuances to that narrative. And you realize that they don't need to tell you. They don't need to tell you, you have to love me, you have to do it for me. But from your perspective as an African, when you go, you're like, yeah, I do believe that there are certain things that we need to pay attention to that are different from what we always hear about the narrative when it comes to Western media. And when you look at it from the Chinese perspective, you're like, yeah, they're kind of looking into the perspective of saying, let's poke holes, as you say, let's poke holes into the narrative of saying that China is bad, China is this and that. And that's really, just to resonate to what she was saying, yeah, that's really quite really sad of what they do.
No, absolutely. So I think this is definitely a piece.
Yeah,
it's a piece of it. It's definitely a part of it, and I think it also reinforces other lines of effort like party to party work.
Yeah.
You see, the media that just doesn't exist in its own space. It's also part of a larger
strategy
element.
Yeah.
Yes, and what I liked, sometimes, when I think about the Chinese tactics, official Chinese tactics, it's almost like when you have when you're planting, and you have a basin with your seeds, and you're getting those seeds and you're throwing them right on the soil, right? And some of those seeds are going to get eaten by birds. Some of them are going to dry up and they're going to get burnt by the sun. Others are going to land on rock and they'll be of no use. But there'll be those that will actually grow. Exactly. Right? And those that, and it seems to me that the official Chinese concept of numbers, we're training so many, we're doing so many. I think the goal is not to convert press gang all those numbers. Yeah. If out of 1,000 you can get maybe 3. Yeah. That because there are some journalists, let's be frank. Yeah, true. There are some African journalists that are true.
They become today completely sold to China.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. There are some, and they're all known. You see, this is the thing, right? I think this might be it. That out of 1,000, maybe get 3. Out of 50, get 1. And this is so. I mean, you've lived in China. Yeah. You know that this is part of Chinese culture. Yeah. It's part of the thinking. It's really part of the thinking. So there's also that element in a sense that it's not just to get everybody, but it's really just to get those few. Mm-hmm. And then of course also the elite, because the elite are always looking for support, political projects, and so on. Exactly. So the biggest support for these Chinese media in Africa is actually the elite, the ruling parties who can get tips. Exactly. On how to remain in office. Exactly. We can't. It cannot be proved. Yeah. But it's there. The Chinese. I was reading Xi Jinping's address to prepare for this presentation. Yeah. I was reading Xi Jinping's address to the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party holds. I think every year they hold this World Political Parties Conference. Exactly. Which brings all these political parties, ruling parties and whatnot to have discussions with the Chinese Communist Party. And I was reading his address to this. And at the bottom of the address, one of the things that he says is, China is open, to share its experience, to share Chinese wisdom, to share Chinese way of doing things. You understand? So it's not direct, but sharing the Chinese experience is basically proselytizing. Exactly. The CCP. You understand? So the people that are most persuaded by that happen to be the guys in government. Exactly.
Paul, we are getting close to our conversation, but I want to take something from your paper, and it's gonna take me to one of the critiques that people tend to raise when they talk about Chinese influence in the media in Africa. When you see the strategy, media, content sharing, sharing, paying media in terms of weekly subscriptions and everything. You talk about the case in your report. You talk about the case of a media house in Kenya. You also have different cases in South Africa as well. Do we have to worry about Chinese media strategy influence in Africa in terms of how it can impact Africa thirst of democracy? Do we believe that Chinese media in Africa can really become an instrument, a tool that are going to push back the need and the need for Africa to have democracy? Can we be worried about a Chinese danger in that space?
Potentially. Yeah. Because you see, let me use the example of military. I always go back to military. Exactly. A military reflects the values and ethos of the country that it serves. Yeah. A communist military reflects the interests
of a communist regime,
of a communist party, of a communist regime. A military that adheres to democratic control of armed forces reflects a society that values and takes seriously democracy and accountability. Mm-hmm. Right? A nationalist military is a military that serves a regime that is nationalistic in orientation. Yeah. You see? So we must always look at the larger context in which institutions are operating. Yeah. If we look at the context in which the Chinese media operates, the Chinese media is operating in a context of the absolute party control of the government, of the state, of society, and of the military.
Exactly.
That is how the Chinese media has been socialized. That is how the Chinese media has developed since 1949. Actually, even before, during the Chinese
nationalistic regime,
revolutionary war. So, to that extent, it would be odd for CGTN, for Star Times, for all these Chinese media entities to promote the idea of multi-party democracy, to promote the idea of accountability over
leadership,
state revenue,
exactly,
to promote the idea of an independent parliament. This would be very odd. And I suspect that if it happens, it would lead to people's heads being on the block. People would be fired.
Yeah.
Right? So, to that extent, yes, potentially, what the Chinese media has been raised, the Chinese official media has been raised to do, and its general orientation, would, from that context, be in serious conflict with the principles of independence, the principles of impartial media engagement, the principles of being truthful, because propaganda and truth don't there's propaganda, there's truth. Yeah, so it would potentially harm those values, as I say in the paper, those values that African journalists since the 1960s have been raised to cherish.
Exactly.
And I think African journalists themselves, I mean, this is not a secret. African journalists themselves say this all the time, that yes, there is certain investments that official Chinese media is making, but I think there's a need to continue to defend these values of independence, values of impartiality, values of truth, that celebrated African journalists have been known for.
Yeah.
You understand? So I think to that extent, yes, there could be. And the other issue I would say in closing is that Chinese official media entities are able to operate on the African continent in this way that we've been talking about. How many African media entities do we know that could be able to operate inside the People's Republic of China, be registered according to the laws of the People's Republic of China, and carry out independent, impartial reporting that even demands accountability of the Chinese Communist Party?
Not so many of them.
I don't see this. Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be unreasonable for me to say that this would actually happen. So again, in terms of that reciprocity, I think I did read a number of stories where African journalists were actually complaining, and they were saying, "Look, we can't even have a bureau in Beijing." Yeah. You understand? So whatever, there are some Africans, people like Wodemaya, that have been able to broadcast, but through YouTube, stories and of the African experiences in China,
exactly.
Life in China and so on, but that's where it stops. That's where it ends. I think these would be the two things that I would talk about. And certainly in the context of the democratic backsliding that the African continent has seen over the last 10 years, Africa today needs robust, independent, fearless, truthful media more than ever. Yeah. More than ever. Yeah. It's an important institution.
Yeah. To close that discussion, just one quick question. Do you believe that Chinese media influence compared to the other Western media influence in Africa, are there any difference that we should be looking into? Or are they the same? Because some would say, come on, look at CNN, look at BBC, look at VOA. They also have their own subtle way of sharing their own narrative, their own way of perceiving things. They are public media. No, none of them, or not all of them are public media, but even though they're not public media, so they can be private, but those private media are obeying to powerful private interests that also want to share a certain kind of narrative in Africa. At the end, it's just a battle for narrative. each of them being Chinese or Western, they use the tool they have in their hands to shape the minds and the hearts of Africans toward any kind of topic, being Western or Chinese. At the end, China just does what he has it in hand, and the West is also responding with what he had at the end. But at the end, Africa needs to also, to, as you say, to develop its own strong, powerful, independent, truthful, factual media that's being able to say, when something comes from the CNN, it can be true, it can also be wrong. When it comes from CGTN, it can be true, it can be wrong. But from African, we can really tell you what really has happened in the ground. So, any differences, or do you think that at the end, one has much more positive influence on the other?
Well, I think Western media, BBC, CNNs of this world, the RFE of this world, all these other media entities. I mean, these are sort of like household brands in Africa. These are household names. These are brands that are known. In fact, the retrenchment of BBC from Africa was very, very unpopular with listeners. You had this Network Africa in the morning, and then you had Focus on Africa in the evening. Everybody listened to Network Africa. I mean, as a student, I mean, this is what I consumed.
In Francophone Africa, it was RFE every morning, every RFE, 6 a.m. until 9 a.m. It was RFE.
Yes. So they're better known. They also have very good journalists, African journalists that were there. There were some African journalists, the names will come in a minute, but which were household, right? For Voice of America, people like Shaka Sali was just known. These were African voices, right? Yeah. African names that were known. So to that extent, I think that, there's no question that, Western media entities are much more embedded in the African milieu, in the African psyche. I think some of that has to do with language. Some of that has to do with culture. Some of that has to, because the culture, the distance,
the language as well.
And even it's really important. And I think. Yes, there were certain narratives that were obviously, I mean, if we look at the Cold War, and if we look at now, in the context of a strategic competition that is taking place between China and Western countries, that might also be seeping into the media space. But I still contend that on the Western side, you don't really have this,
control, strategy,
the tightness of the message, and it tends to have an effect on its own, and some of those effects are not even planned for, right? On the Chinese side, the effects are planned for.
It's much more
controlled. They're planned for and so on. So I think this would be where the difference is. And we would have to wait and see, maybe 5-10 years, to see how effective, both, the traditional Western media as it has been known in Africa, and the new Chinese media, and to see which direction they would go. But I think that in terms of popularity, I still think the elite
will go for
the regimes, the governments, because you see, the Chinese media also give them a lot of airtime.
Definitely,
they report favorably on them. They report on their projects, on their pet projects.
Exactly.
They don't have to pay for it. You see, so the BBC is not going to do that.
Exactly. But CGTN will be doing that. They will tell you this is positive journalism toward Africa. I was talking to a Chinese journalist, he was telling me, we don't talk about all those issues about bad things that happen in Africa, because we believe that the Western media are doing already a good job enough to portray Africa being bad. So us, we are here to highlight things that work. We're going to be highlighting, roads that are being constructed, a speed train being built and everything. We're going to leave the Western media talking about coup d'etat, instability, corruption and everything. And I was like, that's interesting. They choose the angle. Some would say you are covering corruption and all bad governance. Some would say, no, they're really doing positive journalism.
Yes, that's what, so in other words, they're saying that there's complementarity.
Exactly.
This
Exactly.
is very interesting.
Exactly. Paul, I really thank you for your time, for taking the time for speaking with me. And friends, Paul has made a very good report. China's strategy to shape Africa's media space. You're going to find it on the website of Africa Center for Strategic Studies. You're going to find it. It's a very interesting report. You can download it, read it, and find different insight information about Chinese media tactics and strategy in Africa, what they do, how they approach it, and what to look for it and what to look for. And as I was saying earlier, Paul is much more into the space of geostrategy, military engagement in Africa, Chinese military engagement in Africa. You want to know more about what China does, the cooperation between Africa's armies and Chinese army. Go look for Paul Nantulya on Google. I'm telling you, you won't be disappointed. Paul, thank you for your time, and I hope I'm going to have you next time for another paper you're going to publish, and we're going to talk about securities and army. And this is, my pleasure to have you on the show.
No, thank you so much. You've been so kind with your introduction, so kind with your time. So really, I'm very humbled. I'm really very humbled. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would definitely love to come back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.